It is difficult with the first. Thank you for your invitation, brothers and sisters, dear friends. It is not easy to summarize 700 years of history of a movement who then became a church, but it has been a movement for many, many, many years. It is also difficult to say the history of the Waldensian in Italy, because the Waldensian movement has been, for centuries, a European movement. And very often they were connected from one side of the borders to the other. So I will start saying that traditionally we tend to divide the history of the Waldensian Church in 3 steps: the Middle Age, the Reformation, and from civil rights and liberties to nowadays. The Middle Age. Peter Valdo, well, we are not even sure what was his name. Valdo, Valdesius, because the language they spoke at that moment was the Old Provençal language. And Peter is a name who came only in the 14th century, so 2 centuries after the beginning of the Waldensian movement. We know that he was a merchant in Lyon, in the south of France, and that he decided to give everything to the poor and becoming an itinerant preacher. And he paid for parts of the Bible to be translated in the people's language. That is one of the elements which always have been present in the Waldensian history. The Bible in the language of the people. He made a choice, which was a choice of poverty. A choice made 50 years later, for example, by Francis of Assisi. But the difference with Francis of Assisi was that he, at one moment of his life, said it is most important to obey to God than to men. And so when the Pope ordered to his movement to stop preaching, he decided to go on. They didn't call themselves Waldensians. They were called Waldensians by the enemies. Very often happens in history. They called themselves the poor of Lyon, when they start preaching outside the town. And what it is quite interesting is that in their preaching, reading the Bible, they anticipate something that will be discovered or rediscovered by Reformation 400 years later. Not because they were particularly clever, but because they lived in one moment of history, which is called by historians the First Reformation, which wasn't successful. They were almost all killed, put in prison, forced to renounce to their preaching, because there were not only the Waldenses in 12th century in Europe. There were many movements who were criticizing what the Catholic Church was beginning in that period, in that period of history. The Catholic Church in Middle Age, 11th and 12th century, was becoming the most powerful organization of Europe. And had invented some theological ideas, like purgatory, for instance, which gave to the church the power to control not only this world, but also the future world. And the Waldenses started criticizing this, saying this was not given to the apostle as power. They said, we must preach the gospel, the pure gospel of Jesus Christ, and not seeking power. At the beginning, they didn't want to make a new religion, not even a new confession. They simply wanted to preach the gospel. And they managed to ask to the Catholic authorities the preaching of the gospel. Eventually, they went to Rome in 1179. And we are lucky enough to have a witness of that period, an Englishman, who wrote about the meeting of the Waldenses with the Pope and with the Council, Lateran Council. And this man, called Walter Map, wrote, these people are very simple. They follow a naked Christ. Their beginning are very humble, but if we allow them to go on, they will throw out us. That was prophetical. Because at that moment, the first repression against the Waldenses started. 1183, the Council of Verona considered them an heretical movement, and then again, 1215, another declaration against the Waldenses. Together with other movements who wanted to change the church in that period of Middle Age, all these other movements disappeared. The difference, what makes the Waldensians different, is that they still survive till nowadays. Why this? Well, I'm a pastor, so I think that there is a rule of the Lord in this, but that is not history. That is my personal faith. The Waldensian movement from the south of France spread throughout all Europe. Well, really not all Europe, but let us say Spain, France, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, and as far as Poland. There were many Waldensian groups in Middle Age in Europe. They were connected sometime, yes. For instance, we know that exactly 800 years ago, in 1218, they gathered in Bergamo, in the north of Italy, in Lombardy. And they gathered to discuss their different view of what the movement should be. Because, you know, still nowadays, the Waldensians never agree on one point. They have always to discuss. And that started quite many years ago, probably not here, I don't know, in Valdese, but nowadays in Italy it is still the same thing. Well, jokes apart. In 1218, they gathered in Bergamo to discuss what the movement should be. They agreed on many things. First, that the Bible is the light of the movement. Second, that the preaching is dedicated to all people. All people is authorized to preach the gospel, because the apostles were laymen, not priests. Even we know that in the 12th and 13th century, there were women, Waldensian women preaching, which is rather unique in the history of Christianity of that period. They didn't agree on 2 points. The Waldenses coming from France still believed that to receive the Holy Communion they had to go in a Catholic church, while the Waldensians of Italy said no, we are entitled to celebrate by ourselves the communion. And the second thing is that at that moment already, some people said, well, we cannot all go around preaching the gospel. Some of us can settle down, have a secular job, and staying in a place, having a family. While the French still believed that the true Waldensian is the one who is following Christ, not having a place where to stay. We don't know what happened after, because the Inquisition started, and the Waldensians started to be chased in all of Europe. So they didn't have the opportunity to meet, to discuss anymore. They had to start to live, hiding themselves, although they never renounced to go on with the preaching of the gospel. The Inquisition started to say, Waldensians are allowing women to preach, so the Waldensian women are witches. Well, I say this sometimes to my wife when I discuss with her. Probably they weren't completely wrong. Well, that's another question. But being considered witches in that period meant be burned at the stake, be tortured. And the Waldenses in Middle Age kept secret contact among them. They had an organization which grew up through the centuries, which eventually led them to have itinerant preachers called Barba. Barba is a Provençal name which means uncle. It is a respectful title, but it was also in order not to call father their preachers. And the Barba movement was a movement which throughout all of Europe tried to keep the contact among the Waldenses living everywhere. The Barba were prepared, we know, in some schools. One is in Agronia Valley in Italy, another was in Milan, another we know it was in Vienna in Austria, but probably there were many more of this center where these preachers during winter were studying by heart the Bible, were studying the addresses of people that they used to visit in spring, in summer, in autumn. How was the organization? It is not clear yet, and probably it will never be, because we only know this thing from the Inquisition point of view, which was not such a friendly point of view. For instance, when I was younger, many years ago, we were taught that the Barba in Middle Age didn't marry. They were completely dedicated to the preaching of the gospel, and they visited these groups without having a family life. But after that, recent study demonstrated that some Barba were married. That one of them, Barba Martino, questioned by the Inquisition, said, I am a Barba, yes, and I am son of a Barba. And I am from the center of Italy, but I visit the groups in the north of Italy, in the center of Italy, and also in France. The mystery for me is how they could manage to survive for centuries, being hidden, not proclaiming openly their faith. They were visited by the Barbars. They had, we suppose, services at home. But after that, they had to be considered Catholic, as everybody was, because at that moment didn't exist town halls. You were baptized in the church, you had to marry in the church, you were buried in the church. But then, if you were Waldenses, you kept a secret faith, which was enforced by the visit of the Barbars. And this lasted for centuries. Well, with many difficulties and with many defeats. First of all, in 14th century, in the main Italian towns, you know, Italy didn't exist until 1861. Italy was divided in many states, and in many Italian towns and Italian states, the Pope party won, and so the Waldenses had to leave, and eventually they found a refuge in the Cottian Alps, in the so-called Waldensian valleys, where a group of them had always been there. But many others were forced to give up to their faith and to become Catholic. Otherwise, they would have been tortured and killed. It is interesting to know that they used to speak and write in Provençal language or Occitan language. We have some files of that period, some documents, and they are all written in this old language, which was the language that was popularly spoken by the Waldenses of the 19th century when they arrived here. They used the French for the worship, but for everyday life, they used to speak the Provençal dialect, the so-called patois. I said this because at one turning point of the Waldensian history, they will also change their language. And the turning point will be, and it is the second step, will be the Reformation. The Waldenses used to gather, I don't know which regularity, I don't know, but they used to gather as barba, but also as laymen from time to time. And in around 1530, they heard that something was happening somewhere in the north of Europe. that something was the Reformation. And they sent 2 times a delegation of 2 barber up in the north to see what was this novelty, what was new. And they eventually went in contact with the reformers in Switzerland. Not in Germany, it was too far, traveling to the north of Germany. But they came in contact with the reformer of the town of Basel, who sent them to the reformer of the town of Strasbourg. And they asked him some questions. And the reformers answered. And the Waldensians found that what the Reformation was saying was not exactly what they used to teach, but it was very alike. And so they started to discuss whether to join or not join the Reformation. I must tell that at that moment, Reformation was not yet a different church. It was a movement. The Valdensians in 1532 decided to join the Reform movement. 1532, 4 years before the Reformation of Geneva. And in that gathering, in Angronia Valley, again, in the valleys of north of Italy, in that gathering, they decided, among many other things, to translate the Bible into the language of the people. But not anymore, the language was the Provençal. They decided to translate it in French. The first Protestant translation, French translation of the Bible, was paid and organized by the Waldenses when they decided to join the Reformation. The translation was made by a cousin of John Calvin, Pierre Robert, called Olivetan. And at that moment, the life of the Waldenses changed completely. They were not anymore a European movement, but they were reformed. So where the Reformation had success, they simply joined the local Reformed organization in Switzerland, in Austria, in Germany, partly in France. And so the Waldenses found themselves to be an Italian group, because in Italy the Reformation didn't happen. Mind you, that doesn't mean that there weren't Italians who wanted to be reformed. In every Italian region, there were people who wanted to join the Reformation. They were either repressed, they were either persecuted, or they had to leave Italy, as for instance, many people from Tuscany who went in Switzerland. And the Waldenses were there in this northwestern part of Italy, the only non-Catholic Christian organization. This gave the possibility to the Catholic Church and to the Duke of Savoy, who was the ruler of that area where the Waldenses lived, to try to destroy them. I could have done an history of date, war, persecution, but I don't want to do that. I just quote some things. For instance, 1561. There were Waldenses also in the south of Italy, in Calabria and in Puglia. Probably people who emigrated in 13th, 14th century from the north of Italy down. They were all killed or forced to become Catholic. There were, we know, about 10, 15, perhaps 25 villages in Calabria. Some of them are still recognizable because one of them is called San Sisto dei Valdesi. Another one is called Guardia Piemontese. And in these villages, they managed to be Waldenses until 1561. And then the persecution arrived. The pastor who was there, Giovanluigi Pasquale, was converted, was a Piedmontese converted to Protestantism, and was sent there by John Calvin. He was arrested and burned at the stake in Rome in front of Vatican. The other pastor, Bonello, was burned at the stake in Palermo. And then the Jesuits had a great idea. The Jesuits were the great enemies of the Waldensian movement and Protestantism in Italy. Had the idea to go in Puglia, where still there were other Waldenses, and to convince them to be converted. In Latin is beautiful, cum suavitate, with sweetness. And their idea of sweetness was visiting the Waldenses and saying them, oh, poor people, you don't want to be killed and tortured as your brother and sister in Calabria. And they were forced to become Catholic. So, what it used to be a European movement, an Italian movement, narrowed and narrowed, and became what we know nowadays as the Waldenses living in that small part of the Cottian Alps in the north of Italy. But nevertheless, although they were smaller, weaker, the idea of destroying this presence was always in the project of the Duke of Savoy, also because they had many pressure from the Pope of Rome to end with this heresy, because it's a thing which is difficult to understand for us modern people nowadays. But in 16th century, if your prince, if your ruler had one religion, you should all share the same religion. That was the law of that time. So if you wanted to be of a different religion than your prince, you were considered an enemy of the state. And so there were also not only religious but also political motivation to persecute the Waldenses. You aren't sleeping yet? No. Still following me? You understand I am speaking English? No, that, at least that is what I pretend to speak. Well, okay, let's go on. 1561, the big persecution. Tomorrow, someone who is more important than me as historian will tell you about the destruction of the Waldenses in the south of France. And so the Waldenses were a small group, but Now the Reformation existed. So there were contacts with Switzerland and overall with the French Protestant, the Huguenot movement. So the Waldenses became smaller as group, but being part of the big family of Reformed churches, they found that they had many allied brothers and sisters around the borders of the Cottian Alps where they lived. In the 16th century, when there was a big when the Duke of Savoy wanted to kill them, to destroy the Waldenses, they had to face a problem. And the problem was, shall we go on with a pacifist attitude that many Waldenses had in Middle Age, or shall we resist with fighting a war, a defensive war? Calvin wrote them, you shouldn't resist to your prince. They said, okay, thank you, and they did exactly the contrary. So they decided, I don't know why, but they decided that they had to resist against those who wanted to destroy them. And this is an history which lasted for at least 200 years. In 1555, they built the first churches. Building a church was nothing, but the meaning of that church was important, because they had lived as a hidden movement for centuries, and now they built their church, they started to preach publicly, the minister was there. And that was considered rebellion against the Duke of Savoy. They tried everything to destroy them. But in the meantime, they found that on the same Alps, Reformation ideas were coming down from France. And so they discovered that at the end of 16th century, that there were many Protestants and Waldenses in that part of Italy that it is called as the region of Piedmont. In a certain point of the history, they say they had 40 ministers preaching in that area. We never had, since that period, so many places of worship. Because, again, the repression started against the Italian Reformed people. And the Waldenses, they found themselves again reduced to a small group living in 3-4 valleys. There is not only a history of persecutions. There is also an history which is tied with the history of Europe of that period. 1630, the big plague, which killed 2/3 of Europeans in that period, arrived in the Waldensian valleys. And I don't remember exactly the figures, but I think 14 of the 16 ministers were killed. So the Waldenses had to ask to Geneva to send some ministers. And those ministers arrived, they were French or Swiss, and of course, they only spoke French. And they brought the Presbyterian Swiss organization into the life of the Waldensian Church. So French became officially the language of the Waldensian Church, and it lasted for centuries. I always say that a plague brought French language to the Waldenses, and another plague took it away. The other plague had a name, Mussolini, who forbid the use of French in public speaking. But now let's go on. The 17th century is the terrible century of persecution. I'm just going to give you two dates. Now I must say two dates. First date, 1655. 1655, the Waldenses are asked to leave the valleys or to become Catholic or to withdraw up in the mountains because there had been a treaty 100 years before, 90 years before, the treaty of the so-called Peace of Cavour, in which the Waldenses had been authorized to survive in that area, but just up in the mountains. The Waldenses didn't wanted to withdraw, so they start sending petition, asking, discussing with the court of Turin, the Duke of Savoy. And they were asked, in order to show that they were good subject of the Duke of Savoy, they were asked to host the troops who were passing by in that area. But those troops had the order during the night before Easter to kill the Waldenses. And this is known as the Piedmontese Easter in history. It was a mass slaughter. The Waldenses survived thanks to three elements. First of all, one of them, called Janavel, but also another called Javier, started a resistance movement, a guerrilla movement, so that the troop of the Duke of Savoy couldn't be quiet in the valleys because they were continuously attacked by this guerrilla. Second, the moderator of the church, Pastor Lange, could escape in France. It wasn't difficult because France was just over the Kisone River, because in that period France was ruling on a part of Piedmont that nowadays is Italy, but it was France at that moment. And Moderator Javier wrote a book later and informed all the Protestants in France, and then in England, in Holland, in Switzerland, of what was happening in the valleys. And the third thing is that the international pressure on the Duke of Savoy from Protestant states was a massive pressure. Just an example. At that moment, Oliver Cromwell was ruling England as Lord Protector. He sent his ambassador, Samuel Morland, to the court of Turin, saying, that he was on the Waldensian side. John Milton, I think that you studied John Milton at school. Perhaps you don't know, he wrote a poem about the Waldensians. Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughter sends. And so all this pressure forced the Duke of Savoy, I am quoting, to forgive the Waldenses. They had to be forgiven because they didn't want to be slaughtered, which is a rather interesting point of view. Jeannevel and some other people didn't trust the Duke of Savoy. They went on with the resistance movement. But in 1664, eventually, they had to go in exile in Switzerland. And then we come to another date, 1685. Revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Again, this will be explained better than I could do tomorrow. But you must think that the revocation of the Edict of Nantes meant that two valleys in which the Waldensians were living, Val Chisone and Val Pragelato, were French at that moment. They had to leave and to go first in Switzerland and then in Germany, in exile. And 1 year later, the nephew of the King of France, who was the ruler of Savoy, decided to do the same thing against the Waldenses. The Waldenses discussed what can we do. The French ambassador, no, sorry, not the French, the Swiss ambassador came and said to them, you must leave. There is no possibility to resist. There are no other Protestants around you. You must go in exile. And they decided to resist again. And they were convinced to resist by a pastor, Henri Arnaud, a French pastor whose mother was Waldensian. And they were completely defeated. Another slaughtering, and all the remaining Waldenses were closed in 13 prisons throughout all Piedmont. And the history of the Waldensian Church finished here. No, it doesn't finish here. Why? Because 1 year later, the Duke of Savoy decided to leave the Waldenses who were in prison to go in exile in Switzerland. Why? Because he had some political program. And so the remaining 2,500 Waldenses went in exile in Switzerland. They couldn't stay in Switzerland because at that moment Geneva was hosting 100,000 of Protestants coming from France in exile at the same period. But they could go up in Germany, but they didn't want. They organized a military expedition to come back in the Waldensian Valley. It is the so-called Glorious Return, which is, from my point of view, as a pastor, a miracle. But from the historical point of view, something which was successful because the pastor Arnaud had already gone up in Holland to meet the Lord Protector of Holland, William of Orange. William of Orange financed the Glorious Return. And when the Waldenses came back in 1699 in their valley, William of Orange was called by England to become the new King of England. So the Waldenses had this possibility to be linked with the European politics. And this gave them the possibility to survive. They came back, of course, again, the Duke of Savoy didn't maintain all promises, because he said, okay, if the Valdenses want to come back here in the valley, they can do that if they come to fight with my army against my uncle, the King of France. And the Waldenses said, well, we don't have other possibility, let's do that. But when the war was over, the Duke of Savoy said, well, I didn't give any promise about the subject who were Protestant and French. And so two valleys where Waldenses lived never were repopulated by Waldenses. And tomorrow, you will hear from Albert de Lange what's happened to these Waldenses who had to go in Germany. And then, and I am almost finished, don't be afraid. Torture is almost over. And then the 18th century came. We call the century of the ghetto, which is not, it is not correct, because ghetto was a closed area where the Jews had to stay. They were closed during the night in the main Italian cities. The Waldensian Valley were not a ghetto because there had always been Catholic and Valdenses living in the villages. The Valdenses had to pay more taxes. They didn't have all the rights of the Catholics, but they weren't confined into a ghetto. Simply they couldn't get out of the valleys. Or well, they could. If they wanted to be soldier of the Duke of Savoy, provided they didn't want to become an officer, of course. But otherwise, they had to live in that ghetto, with many threats. Just one example. People were paid by Jesuits to kidnap Waldensian children, who were then brought in Turin, and later on in Pinerolo, the town near the Waldensian Valley, where there was an hospice for the young Waldenses who were educated as good Catholic and then sold as servants in the noble families of Piedmont. And that lasted till the French Revolution, 1789. And when the French Revolution arrived in the Waldensian valleys in Italy, the Waldenses were all for the revolution, because that meant equal opportunities for all, equality in front of the law. The former moderator was even governor of the region under Napoleon's rule. But we know that Napoleon was defeated. And in 1814, when the King of Savoy came back from the exile in Sardinia, the first thing he does is to sign a paper saying, all the liberty we have given to Valdenses and Jews are revocated. We go back to the law of 1561. Nevertheless, the Valdenses tried to look at the future, because they knew that the idea were changing. Almost all Europe had freedom of religion at that moment. Well, not all Europe, mainly Protestant countries of Europe or France. So they knew that things had to be changed. Things would change. And they waited. But it was not waiting without doing anything. They were helped mainly by English travelers who discovered the Waldenses. And one of them, called John Charles Pasquet, helped them to establish a network of schools throughout the valley, so that at the end of 19th century, illiteracy in Italy was 90%. In the Waldensian valleys was almost 10%. You know the difference? And the Waldenses built all this school, although they were poor, because they had two convictions. The first is that every Christian must be free to read his own Bible. And the second is that culture is not a sin. Culture is important. When finally, and I am at the third step, 17 February 1848, the King of Savoy, Charles Albert, signed the freedom for them, they decided to accept the challenge which was given to them by John Pasquet, who said to them, from now onward, either you will be missionary or you will be nothing. And they said, well, let's try to convert Italian to the Bible. Sometimes when I think to my forefathers, I said, but they were so naive. It's impossible to convert Italians. Not even not to be corrupted when they become politicians, but that's another thing. That's another thing. No, but, you know, they were naive, but they had a big project, which was important. They said, why did the Lord saved us for centuries in this small part of Italy? And their answer was simple. Because one day he would have needed someone to preach the gospel to the Italian. It was naive, but it was a project. And on the base of this project, they started building and preaching schools and building new churches. So that nowadays, but that will be my speech of tomorrow, nowadays we have half of the Waldenses living still in the Waldensian valleys from where many ancestors came here, and the other half are living throughout all of Italy. Because the region in Italy which has the biggest number of Waldenses is Piedmont, but the second is Sicily. Can you realize that? On the other side of Italy, because evangelism was successful in some of these areas. And I would like to end with a joke. The Waldenses used, in order to preach the gospel to Italy, 3 things. The colporteur, Bible sellers, the teachers, and eventually the pastors. But the pastor came later, when a church was already established. And you perhaps don't know that the last part of Italy, which was put together, was Rome. Rome, till 1870, was still owned by the Pope. And eventually the king of Italy decided to attack Rome and to take it to the Pope. And they started bombing the wall of Rome, and one of these walls fell down, and the Italian soldier entered in Rome. There was a Bible seller following these soldiers. He had a chariot who was pulled by a big dog, Saint Bernard dog. And the tradition, but that is not history, it's just a funny history. The tradition says that this colporteur, this Bible seller, called his dog Pius IX. That gives you another insight, of which I will speak tomorrow, of what was the idea of the Valdenses when they started to preach the gospel in Italy. Total separation among church and state. And this is still our conviction nowadays. Thank you, and I hope it wasn't too boring for you.
Thank you, Claudio. If I may ask the first question, I know that as the Waldensians started the movement across Europe, the one area that they were most successful in was Austria and Germany.
Yes.
And so in the 13th and early 14th century, there were more Waldensians in Austria and Germany than there were anywhere else at that point.
Yeah.
So the question that has been in the back of my mind, I know biblical scholars or historians are looking and saying, we don't know what happened to them, why the movement suddenly collapsed. However, I was, in my mind, I'm thinking, is it possible that that movement stayed underground and was one of the reasons why Germany became the location of the Reformation in 1517? So I just wonder if that, the thinking and the perspective against the Roman Church at that time stayed there underground and just was waiting for a leader to take it.
It's difficult to have an answer which is historically founded, because I don't know. But we know, but since I was speaking of Waldensian in Italy, I didn't want to speak of that otherwise, but we know, for instance, that the Valdenses had many links with the Hussite movement. And the Hussite movement was a reformation in the Czech Republic, what is Czech Republic nowadays, in 15th century, so before the Reformation time. And many of them had links so close that, for instance, in Austria, we know that there were Valdenses till the 16th century, and then they disappeared. No, they don't disappear. They didn't disappear. They simply joined the Reformation. That's my idea, because also in Germany there were, we know that there were Waldenses in Wittenberg in 15th century, so 100 years before Reformation. What happened to them? All killed, all disappeared? I don't think so. I think that simply some of them joined the Reformation.
I agree.
Yeah. For instance, I tell you another little story. When I came the first time in the States, I was brought to Bethlehem in Pennsylvania, where there are the Moravians. And I went to visit them as a tourist, and I said, hello, I am a Waldensian minister. And they said, Waldensian, great. I didn't know why. Because they said, our first preacher was ordained by a Waldensian barber. That is their history. And I discovered that, I'm a bit ashamed to confess that, in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I didn't know. Well, I knew there were many Waldenses in Austria, but not that there were this link who survived till nowadays in the history of the Moravian people.
May add to that, Craig Atwood, who some of us know here, is a writer who has written a book on the connection between the Waldensians and the Moravians, and his book is, I've got it on my shelf, but his book is available, so if you look up Craig Atwood and his work with the Moravian Church, it certainly shows connections between the two. Questions? Yes, Nancy.
You've talked a lot about literacy, and that's dear to my heart. You started and ended with
Can you
literacy.
speak a bit louder because I am deaf?
Okay, how's this?
Thank you.
Okay, you started and ended talking about literacy, and you talked about literacy throughout. I believe you started talking about Waldo was concerned about getting Bibles into the hands of the people that the people could read. Well, that you said 1100s, that's 400 years before the printing press. I'm familiar in my studies about the religious uprisings, goings on in England, and I know that when a Bible was available to Protestants there, the churches would chain them in the back of the church so people could see them, and of course they'd put them next to Fox's Book of Martyrs, which, by the way, the Waldensians are in.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering how he went about that, and did everybody have a copy, or were there lots of copies available? Will you explain that to me, please?
Okay, yes. Well, that's a very good question. The Bible at that moment were all handwritten, okay? There was no, the press, but the Valdenses Barba learned large part of the Bible by heart. And then they used to repeat it when visiting people, also because many of them in Middle Age were illiterate. They couldn't read. So it was a oral preaching, but based on the Bible. Also because it wasn't so easy to go around Italy or Europe with an handwritten Bible. So mainly it was an oral preaching and the oral learning of the Bible. In the so-called School of the Barba, we suppose, because we don't know exactly yet, and probably we will never know, but we suppose they spend large part of their time learning the Bible by heart and also learning what they had to teach. We know from several manuscripts that are nowadays, Waldensian manuscripts that are nowadays in Geneva, in Cambridge, in Dublin, that they also wrote poems based on the Bible. For instance, the most known poem is the Noble Lesson. And the Noble Lesson is based on the Bible, but it is a teaching about what the Bible teach and says to the simple believer.
Thank you. And I might add that if the Waldensian Barba were caught with the Bible in their possession and they were traveling, they would be persecuted as heretics.
Oh, yes, of course.
Anyone else? John.
There's certainly some students locally here that are of the belief that most of us think is mistaken, but I want you to comment on the fact that somehow they believe that the Waldensian movement extends back hundreds of years prior to Waldo to the time of the apostles. And can you speak to that, yes or no?
Well, there are no historical evidence of it. But this legend was believed by the Valdenses till 19th century. Because in one book that the Apostle Paul wrote in the Bible, he says that he would like to go to preach the gospel in Spain. And the Valdenses thought, since Paul had bad adventure by sea, probably he wanted to go to Spain, passing through the Alps, through France, and down to Spain. But it's a legend. We have no historical evidence of it, I repeat. But this was believed, for instance, by many English people, Anglican people, who came to the valleys in 18th and 19th century, because, you know, Anglican were always upset because they were accused by the Catholics. They said, oh yes, you have a church, but you don't have the apostolic succession as we have. We have the apostolic succession, you don't. And they, when they heard that the Valdenses were preached by the Apostle Paul, they said, we found our apostolic succession. Yeah, no, but that is on the level of legend. Historian never found anything about that.
Any questions? Yes. June spent a couple of years over there in the 70s, so June?
What evidence is there of women preaching in the 1300s? I know that there are their illustrations are wood. There were wood carvings in some of the documents and stuff of women preaching, but is there written and historical evidence of women, Waldensian women preaching? And then there's another part to this, more recent history. When were women allowed to be ordained in the Waldensian church?
I'll answer in 3 times. I'm sorry, but it's quite... First of all, we know that some inquisitors, so people who were trying to destroy Waldenses, are saying they allow the women preaching. We know that one of these inquisitors says, I have, and he was horrified, I have even saw a woman that was breaking the bread and giving the cup. But you know, that for him it was the evidence that the Waldenses were adoring the devil. Second element, we know that the women had a rule in Middle Age, because when in 16th century the Valdenses asked to the reformers something. They said, we have some houses where live our sorors, our sisters. And the preachers, the barba, must spend 1 year of their life there. What shall we do with these houses where we have our sisters? And sadly enough, the reformers said, close the houses and marry that woman. Yeah? Well, probably we lost something, but you know. And then we only started ordaining women in the ministry in the 1960, more or less when the other European churches started, yes. But we forgot about it for 300 years, at least.
Anyone else? Yes, Steve.
You mentioned the plague. and how that affected the Waldensian pastors. But 200 years earlier, there was a great plague, the Black Death,
Yes.
1347, 1350.
Yes.
It wiped out almost, or did wipe out, half of Europe.
Yes.
Because the Waldenses were such a small group, how did they survive that plague? I've not been able to find anything in the Waldensian history.
And you won't receive an answer by myself because it is not so clear. Well, one answer is that at that moment, the Waldensian didn't live all together in the valleys. They were a European movement, so probably not all areas were affected in the same way or in the same time. But I have no answer to that. I'm sorry.
Well, that partly answers it, that they were more spread out.
Yeah, they were more spread
concentrated.
out. That's...
Okay, thank you.
Claudio, can you speak about Claudio of Turin?
Claudio?
Claudio of Turin.
Oh, yes.
Torino.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because the Waldensians have recognized a kindred spirit in a man who pre-existed them by 300 years, 350 years.
Yes, yes.
So can you speak to that?
Yes. When the Waldenses, after 1848, received civil rights and liberties, they opened one of the first churches outside the valleys in the town of Turin. And they started to preach in Italian there because the Italian couldn't understand French. Many of them couldn't understand French. And they decided to have I have not the word, a publishing house. And they called it Claudiana. The publisher of the Waldensian Church is called Claudiana. And they refer to the Bishop Claudius, who lived in Turin in 9th century. Because this bishop is reckoned to be a reformed bishop before Reformation, because he decided to put the Bible on all altars. He fight against the adoration of images, and he was kind of the Western Church before the Middle Age big changement of the Catholic Church, where bishops like Claudius could exist and could do their work preaching the gospel. So the Waldenses said, we are not another church. We are the Holy Catholic Church, exactly as Claudio was. I don't know if I answered because I'm not so prepared on that.
Any other questions?
Stop.
Yes. One of the things about Claudio, too, is that he was a biblical scholar and interpreted many of the books of the Bible.
Yes.
And so he was, although he was seen by some within the Catholic Church at the time as heretic, because he was such a good biblical scholar, they couldn't touch him.
Yeah.
So was it Pope Leo the 10th or somebody like that who was who decided to really persecute the Waldensians? I mean, who was the first pope who decided that, you know, people like Claudio shouldn't be there, and wanted to consolidate the Catholic Church take control?
Oh, that's difficult to answer because it was really a movement in the church around the year 1100. In that period, new doctrine came into the Catholic Church. For instance, the doctrine of purgatory. Before that period, it wasn't a doctrine that all people had to believe. But after that, was a doctrine that all people had to believe. Or another example, Catholic priests could marry before that period. For 1,000 years, the Catholic priest could be married. That was also a change in the. And then also, since there were movements who wanted to change the church, there were many fights against this movement. I'm trying to find where I wrote something about that. Well, I don't find it. However, in 14th century, in 13th century, and 14th century, there was in the south of France a big movement, which was not a reform movement, was a new religion, the Cathar movement. And the Cathar movement was completely defeated by a crusade in the south of France made by a pope. And in that crusade, all Cathar were forced to either to leave or to give up to their religion. The Valdenses were also involved in that persecution, but they eventually survived. I don't know why.
I'm glad she asked that question because I wanted to ask you about the Avignon papacy, if the Waldensians had it harder because of that. So it sounds like maybe you were alluding to that just now.
Well, you know, the Avignon papacy was a period of great confusion in the Western Church. And in that period, the Waldensians were already preaching that the Pope, if he had a reason to exist, he should only maintain the spiritual power, not the political and economical power. So in that moment, they didn't bother much about Avignon papacy or not, because they already were convinced that the Pope wasn't doing his job. One of the first things that the Waldensians in Middle Age opposed was the legend of the donation of Constantine. This legend was saying that when the Roman Empire, the emperor of the Roman Empire, Constantine, became Christian, he had given all the power to the Pope of Rome. Of course, it was a legend, this one, and this legend was opposed by the Waldenses in Middle Age. I don't know if that was clear.
Follow-up question with that. I know that in the 1480s, ironically, the Pope's name was Innocent.
Innocent, yes.
Innocent also was the one who established a crusade against the Waldensians.
Yes.
And many thousand Waldensians were killed in the 1480s by Pope Innocent. Anyone else?
Well, if one day you will visit the Vatican museums, don't know if you ever seen them, when you walk and you arrive just at the entrance door of the magnificent library, look on the right, there is a beautiful painting saying in Latin that in 12, I don't remember the date, but the Pope condemned Valdensians and Albigensians.
Jensen's, right.
Now it's always interesting when I go there to look at there and say, we are still there.
Yeah. And the Albigensians was another name for the Catholic.
Was that another name for the Catholics? Yes.
So, anyone else? Claudio, thank you.
Thank you to you.